Hi, my name is John Strong, and welcome to Literature and World of the Hebrew Bible. This is session 1. All right, let's move more into the content of an introduction to the Hebrew Bible, or the literature and the world of the Hebrew Bible. And first of all, let me talk about terminology. And one thing you've heard me say right now is Hebrew Bible. You have not heard me talk about the quote-unquote the Old Testament. They're synonymous, the way I'm using them in this class. The Old Testament is a Christian term. There's the Old Testament and there's the New Testament, and that makes up the Christian canon, or the Christian authoritative texts. And so scholarship has adopted the term Hebrew Bible as a more inclusive term, because the Hebrew Bible is a text that is authoritative for Jews who don't have a New Testament, and for Christians who do, and it also is authoritative in many ways to Muslims. And so the Hebrew Bible tends to be has been adopted because it is more descriptive, and that's a loaded term, by the way, and I'll get to that in a minute. It tends to be more descriptive of what this text is. It's Hebrew in language, and it is an authoritative text. It's a Bible. So the Hebrew Bible is what I'll be using in this class. But it is fundamentally synonymous with what Christians refer to as Old Testament. Another term that you'll see in the words associated that show up on your screen and also in the written text are the terms BCE and CE. BCE stands for Before Common Era. You may have heard these terms as BC, and at least in 2005, I'm still, when I'm out in the community talking to people and I use the term BCE, I get some quizzical looks. BCE is synonymous with before Christ, or BC, but it means before Common Era. CE is equivalent to AD, or Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord. But Anno Domini, that Latin phrase, is a very Christian term. And so again, scholarship has adopted BCE, Before Common Era, and CE, Common Era, as descriptive terms to describe the time frames that are common and people commonly use, without bringing in some religious contexts that may not be valid for everybody who's taking this course or everybody that scholarship talks with. It's a more inclusive way to talk about time periods. So BCE and CE are important terms to remember. We'll use them in class. I expect you to use them in your papers. And again, BCE is what most people think of in terms of BC, and CE is what most people think of in terms of AD. Yahweh and Elohim are two terms that you'll hear, and you need to keep them distinct from one another. Yahweh is a personal name that the Hebrews used for their God. They worshipped Yahweh. The people on the island of Tyre worshipped Melkart. People in Moab worshipped Chemosh. People in Assyria worshipped Asher. People in Babylonia, worshipped Marduk. The Hebrew people worshipped Yahweh. It's personal, it's a name, it's a personal name for their God. Okay. It is spelled with the what is called the Tetragrammaton. Tetragrammaton means 4 letters, and the 4 letters are Yod, He, Vav, He, or YHWH. And The vowel letters, out of reverence, were not inserted into the Hebrew text, and so the Tetragrammaton, or YHWH, Yod He, Vav He, the Tetragrammaton was just 4 letters, and it just showed up. And it is exactly how to pronounce it has been forgotten. Scholarship, and in this class, oftentimes we'll refer to the Tetragrammaton as Yahweh. Okay, that's the way that's the term I'll use in this class, and that's the way we'll go forward. Elohim. Elohim is the Hebrew word for God or deity. It is technically a plural, and with El being the singular, but it is a more generic kind of word. And sometimes Elohim and Yahweh are used synonymously in the Hebrew text, but sometimes there's a distinction. Some texts have a preference for Yahweh over Elohim. Other texts have a preference for Elohim over Yahweh. I want you to understand and be able to recognize and remember this distinction, because it's important in how scholarship has understood and analyzed the text, and it's an important distinction. It's going to show up a few sessions down the pike. Now, let's talk about the texts themselves, the Hebrew Bible itself. The Hebrew Bible was written in large part in Hebrew, okay? And I'm going to hold up a version, but this will show up also. Here is the Hebrew Bible. It is, Latin term is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Strangely enough, the Hebrew Bible is written in Hebrew, however, not entirely in Hebrew. There are several chapters, not many, for example, in Daniel and Ezra that are written in Aramaic. And there are a few verses actually in Jeremiah that are written in Aramaic. Now, you may ask, what's the difference between Aramaic and Hebrew? Well, Aramaic and Hebrew are related, but they are dialects of one another. And they are pretty close to one another. It is pretty easy, if you know Hebrew, to learn Aramaic. However, they're not identical. And it just represents the fact that people who lived in certain regions developed one language, one accent, one dialect, and then if they were separated by rivers or space or mileage or mountains or what have you, even though in the past these people may have shared a language, they've developed a new dialect, and that's the way Aramaic and Hebrew are related. They are both what is called part of Northwest Semitic. Northwest Semitic is a good word to have down in your notes and to remember. There are other languages that are related, that are considered Northwest Semitic and are helpful. It was translated, as you know, as after Alexander, the Greek world took over, and there was a pan-Hellenic world out there, pan-Hellenistic world, in which Greek culture, Greek thought, Greek language, and Greek culture was throughout the world. So if you were a Jew whose authoritative text was the Hebrew Bible, and you wanted to read the Torah or the law, how would you do it? Because you only know Greek. Or maybe you know Aramaic, but you don't know ancient Hebrew. So how would you do it? Well, you go to the Septuagint, and the text was translated into Greek. And the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And it differs from, in many ways, the translations do, from the Hebrew Bible, because apparently the folks who translated the Greek Bible, the Greek translation, went to different traditions of text, different textual traditions than what eventually got codified or crystallized or solidified in the Hebrew Bible. And so one of the things that, one of the sub-disciplines in the study of Hebrew Bible is that some people will, it's called textual criticism, and they will compare the Greek texts with the Hebrew texts, identify differences, and then analyze why is it that these two traditions differ in some places. We're not going to go into that very much. That is a detailed and, for some folks, rather tedious process. It gets very complex, and it's more than what we're going to hit on in an introductory course like this. Again, after you've mastered philology and you want something new to do, go to textual criticism, but that's a few years down the line. By the way, that's a good time to laugh if you want to laugh. I don't know if our producers here can add laugh tracks, but probably not. But at any rate, the Hebrew Bible, let me switch texts here. The Hebrew Bible reads right to left. It's different from the way English goes. English goes from left to right. The Greek text goes, just like English, from left to right. But the Hebrew goes right to left. If you go over to Israel Today and you're driving around on the road signs, if you know Hebrew, you'll know that you need to read those things from right to left. And the other thing about Hebrew, when you look at the text, is that you'll see that there are large letters. A lot of them are block-shaped. And underneath them are small little points and small little dots and lines. Okay? The Hebrew text is consonantal in nature. In other words, it's just the consonants that were originally written. And they appear to also have really been written. We write, when we're writing English, above the line. We start with a line down here. We write J-O-H-N above the line. They hung, the Hebrews would hang their letters below the line. Okay? So that you would have a Hey or a Lamed or a Yod or a Vav. They're hanging down. Then, in the ancient Hebrews, the Ezekiel or whoever, they did not include the vowel points. They would write out a word, Elohim, and they know, well, everybody knows Elohim. I don't need to be putting in vowels in there. They didn't have letter markers or letters symbolizing a vowel sound. They didn't have a symbol for an A. They didn't have a symbol for whatever. Okay? That wasn't really a part of what they were, it wasn't the tradition. If you go to Israel Today, they don't use vowel markers. They don't use vowels. So you look at road signs, you just see the Hebrew there. If you pick up a Jerusalem Times today, or whatever the Hebrew paper there is in Jerusalem, it's going to be in Hebrew consonantal script, reading right to left, and it's just the consonants. They don't have vowels. This wraps it up for, I think we're running out of time in terms of this first introductory session. And I want to talk a little bit about how the Hebrew Bible was divided, and a little bit about how scholarship approaches the text, and a little bit about the time frame. And we're going to do that in the next session, and so we'll do that in session 2. To summarize today's session, I gave you a little bit of an introduction about myself, as boring as that was. Gave you a little bit of a discussion, hopefully it was helpful, about how this class is going to work. And the bottom line is, don't write down every word, but write down the important words. In particular, pay attention to what scholarship thinks is significant about the data. Okay? Remember the data, but remember what scholarship thinks is significant about the data. We talked about terminology, the Hebrew Bible, BCE, CE, Yahweh, Elohim, and then we talked about the language that the text is written in. Hebrew, a little bit of Aramaic, translated into Greek in the Septuagint. And that'll do it for this first session, and then we'll come back next session. We'll talk about the divisions of the text. See you then. And the title for this session is Divisions or Organization of the Hebrew Bible and Approaching the Text. And as you can tell from the title, there are two things that I want to get accomplished in this session. Number one, I want to describe, again, the term describe, descriptive is important, and you'll see why a little bit later in this session. But I want to describe the divisions and how the Hebrew Bible is organized. Number two, I want to talk about how scholarship approaches the text and how we're going to approach it here in this class. It may be a little bit different, or here's where you might start to see, if you're accustomed to approaching the text or studying the text in a church or synagogue or in a devotional setting. Nothing wrong with that, but the way scholarship approaches it might be a little bit different, and here's where you're going to start to see that. Okay, so that's the two big issues that we're going to talk about, or items that we're going to talk about today. Organization of the text and approaching the text. In terms of major divisions of the text, there are three major divisions of the text. There's the Torah, or the law. There are the prophets, or the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im is the Hebrew word for prophets. And then there's the writings, or the Ketuvim. Ketuvim is the Hebrew word for the term writings, ketuv, to write. And Ketuvim is the plural, writings. And if you're Jewish or familiar with the Jewish text, you'll know that they refer to their text as the Tanakh. The T comes from the Torah, N from Nevi'im, and then the K or Kaf from the Ketuvim. T-N-K, Tanakh. So a little term about that. Now, let's look at the Torah and what is involved in the Torah. The Torah are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, sometimes referred to as the Law of Moses, sometimes referred to as the first 5 books of Moses. That is an late attribution to these books, but it's the first 5 books. And so it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay, those 5 books. And that constitutes the earliest core, the earliest canon, or collection of authoritative books for ancient Israel. And and it still is most authoritative to this day. Then you come to the prophets. And the prophets actually include what the Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible is called the Nevi'im, the prophets, is actually also contains historical books. It contains Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, and those historical books. Now, that tells you something about how the ancient Hebrews understood these historical books. They weren't just something to learn about history, but it was history with a lesson. History that told them something about how they should be living their life that day. And in that sense, it was prophetic. It was not prophetic. They did not intend it to be prophetic in the sense of that Joshua necessarily foretold far distant future events or somehow mapped out far distant events, but more that these were lessons. These historical events and these historical books, they were lessons. That's important when it comes to reading the historical books like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. It's important because what it tells you is that what's presented is not a complete list of all the historical data, all the historical persons, all the historical events that took place in ancient Israel's life. It's not that. That's not what these historical books have been preserved to do. It's not an encyclopedia that's exhaustive of everything that went on in ancient Israel's past. These books are not that, okay? And at times you even see that. You even see that it glosses over an entire, there may be a king in there, Manasseh, Omri, who reigned for a long, long time, was very powerful, and we know that through archaeology. But the biblical text kind of glosses over him, says, this guy kind of screwed up, okay? And what the historical books are then, they're lessons. And they are supposed to teach the reader something. And so these historical books are prophetic in that sense. It also tells you something about the prophetic books. And here are the prophetic books. And they can be clumped into terms of describing their organization. They're about think of them as 4 books, okay? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, probably everybody's with me now. But then we diverge into the Book of the 12. The Book of the 12 is what in a lot of texts and a lot of people talk about as the quote-unquote the minor prophets. Minor prophets, still a term that you'll hear me using in class. It's still a term that I hear out there in scholarly circles and conferences and reading papers and things like that. But it may be better to think of the Book of the 12 or the 12 minor prophets as a single book. And there's been a very important work by a guy named Jim Nagalski. Don't worry about writing his name down. But there was a fellow, and he started to identify all the links between these books. And now there's a whole score of articles and books and things that link all the cross-referencing between the 12 books of the minor prophets, or the Book of the 12, that would seem to indicate that the ancient Hebrews understood them as not just separate little books, but as a collection that can be read as a whole. And so in this class, I'm wanting you to think about there's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the Book of the 12. The Book of the 12, by the way, I want you to know these books. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, very famous story, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay? So these prophetic texts are part of the Nevi'im, the prophets. They're prophetic works. They are different in nature from the historical books. But also notice that the ancient Hebrews read them together. and they read them again in historical kinds of terms. These are prophets who commented on their days, and their comments were valid and came true in their day, and we should learn from what they said and apply it to us today. They're not prophets in the sense of what they predicted back then is for way on, off, down in the distant future. It's more that these prophets are teaching lessons. And the ancient Hebrews, as they collected this material, they read these Hebrew prophets, these ancient prophets, not because they thought that the prophets were talking about something way off in the distant future or something like that. It's that these were commentators on the historical events and decisions of their day and how they analyzed those events, those decisions, held lessons for the reader and how the reader should analyze the lessons for his day, his or her day. Okay? So the section of the prophets or the Nevi'im contains historical books and prophecies, but all of it really are lessons for the reader to apply to his or her life. Okay? Now, these texts became authoritative for ancient readers after the Torah, okay, but before the writings. The writings are the last works to become authoritative, to become canonized. All right, and that is a little bit of an important concept to keep in mind. Okay, for example, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And well, let's go back. Ezra and Nehemiah are part of the writings, and yet they are historical books. And in the English texts, they're clumped up there with historical books. But that's because the English text organized and actually followed the organization of the Septuagint more closely than it did the Hebrew Bible. And but in terms of historically, when were these books canonized? When did they become authoritative? It's later, and so they show up in the collection of writings of books known as the writings. Okay, the writings include Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, and then Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Okay, 1st and 2nd Chronicles in the Hebrew Bible is the last book. It concludes and brings to a close the Hebrew Bible. It's not true of Septuagint or what a lot of people are accustomed to in English. Malachi, one of the prophets, comes in last. Okay, it closes out the text. Now, there are two terms that, now let's turn to that second section, approaching the text. And I want to state off the top, and this is worth putting down in your notes. In this class, we are going to use a descriptive approach to the Hebrew Bible. Okay, a descriptive approach. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. There are two terms that are very important here, and you ought to get these down. You ought to get some sort of a working definition of the two. Two terms are normative and descriptive. Normative and descriptive. Normative argues that a normative approach says that there is a persuasive element that is trying to bring the reader, the hearer, the other person, the other party along to a particular standard. There's a standard of behavior, a standard of belief, a right belief, a wrong behavior. And a normative approach argues for this so that it will persuade someone to follow this standard, this norm. And So that a normative reading of the text is going to say, okay, Ezekiel said and believed and thought XYZ. Therefore, you should too. Or Joshua says XYZ. And because Joshua says it, then the norm or the standard that we should derive from that is such and such. A normative approach is what you hear on Friday night in the synagogue or Sunday morning in church, or perhaps Friday afternoon from the imam in the mosque. That's a normative approach. A descriptive approach does talk about, it does more than just saying, here's what happened in the text, here's what the words are. It's more than just saying, here's how the texts are arranged. It says, Ezekiel says this, so we understand what Ezekiel believed. And it's a description of what Ezekiel believed. It's a description of Ezekiel's time. It's a description of Ezekiel's belief. It's a description of what Ezekiel tried to persuade his followers or his audience to believe. But it doesn't go that next step and says, therefore you should too. In this class, and here at Missouri State University, we are going to take a descriptive approach as best as we possibly can. Now, some people are going to argue, well, you can never be totally objective, you can never be totally descriptive, you can never totally withhold your personal views, and there's some validity to that. But at the same time, it is my experience that you can give a pretty objective approach. Okay, so what this class is going to deal with, it's going to deal with the ideas that are contained in and carried through the text. Okay. Now let's talk about the time frame in which this book, the Hebrew Bible, was written. There are very early texts that are 3,000 years old. For example, Exodus 15. It's called the Song of the Sea, and it is a song about the Israelites crossing crossing into the Promised Land from Egypt and escaping the Egyptian. And it has that very famous phrase, and the horse and rider he threw into the sea, something to that effect, about how Yahweh fought for Israel and defeated the Egyptians and helped them escape from bondage and become a free nation. That's a very early poem, perhaps written in the 11th century, in other words, about BCE, in other words, about perhaps 1000 BCE. And so you have a text that may be 3,000 years old, representing the celebrations and the memories and the experience of people 3,000 years ago in a distant land, across the ocean, in another terrain. It's an amazing poem. Then, down on the other end of the spectrum, you have the book of Daniel, which seems to have been written in, or at least in its final form, achieved in many of the stories there, people can date them pretty accurately to about 164 BCE. In other words, the 2nd century BCE. So you have a span of time of roughly 900,000 years, okay? Well, what's been going on in that 900 to 1,000 years? Has the world just been static? You know, we've talked about in this television program, this telecourse, how I'm recording this in the year December of 2005, January 2006, and I've talked a little bit about the problems in Iraq and the worries about terrorism and things like that. gas prices are high, and we just had Hurricane Katrina in the fall, and that's the context in which we're living in. By the time someone watches this, if it's still being produced and still being aired on OPT, say 8 or 9 years from now, who's going to remember that? And a lot of people will. I know I will. But a lot of the students who are watching the program then were perhaps 10 or 12 years ago at the time now when it's being taped. And there's been a lot of water and a lot of history, a lot of events going on. It's a different, and my clothes will be out of style, it's sorry to say. And so the bottom line is that time is not static. History is not static. The life of a nation is not static. And neither was Israel's. And so when you look and think this text was collected over and written over a span of 900, 1,000 years, you got to figure, gee whiz, there's a lot that was going on, a lot that happened. And therefore, what does that tell you about the nature of the text? Okay? One of the first things that, and something you ought to get down in your note, is that the Hebrew Bible is not monolithic. What I mean by that is it didn't drop down from the sky all in one piece, boom, in a completed, all wrapped up with a bow tie. Didn't happen. It took a process of about 900,000 years. And it included many different voices from many different geographical regions who had different accents, who had different political perspectives, who had different religious perspectives, who had different life experiences. Some of them were women, some of them were male, and they were all over the map. And so one of the amazing things of the Hebrew Bible is how diverse the Hebrew Bible is and how pluralistic it is. I'm not sure pluralism is a concept or a term a lot of people are using nowadays, at least in 2005, but I still think it's a good term because there's a plurality of viewpoints preserved in the Hebrew Bible. And I think one of the mistakes that some interpreters make in trying to understand the Hebrew Bible is to try and somehow harmonize all of these perspectives into one sort of monolithic perspective that has a certain shape and a certain size and can be easily controlled. Okay? Hebrew Bible defies being controlled. I study Ezekiel, and Ezekiel, one of Ezekiel's main points was God cannot be controlled. And Ezekiel's text cannot be controlled. And a lot of people realize that Ezekiel can't be controlled. That's just one prophet, one perspective. It's not controllable. The Hebrew text is diverse. It's plural. It comes from many times, many different periods of time, many different people, many different geographical regions, spanning 900 to 1,000 years. And so expect diversity. Okay? Let's talk a little bit about what happened over this period of time. Early on, Israel became a nation. You see that in Exodus 15. They separated themselves somehow from Egypt, and there are also texts that talk about people coming from Mesopotamia, from Ur, or from Syria, from Moab, from the Transjordan, from across the river. And they somehow formed, maybe not a nation, but perhaps a tribal league or some sort of a confederation of tribes, tribal confederation. A bunch of tribes, and we have various names, Benjamin, Judah, half tribe of Manasseh, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Dan, all the different Naphtali, all these different tribal names, and we have more than 12. It's one of the challenges to try and identify exactly what the 12 tribes were. But you have different tribes, and somehow they came together at some time and formed some sort of alliances with one another to help each other with in times of war, and to create alliances with each other for protection and that sort of thing. And there was probably some sort of religious nature to some of these covenants and agreements. But it was a tribal confederation. Well, after a while they decided we want to do something a little more structured, a little more centralized, and they became a nation. They became a monarchy. And you see Saul rise up as the first king, and then succeeded by David, and then Solomon, and goes on down a long list of kings. Okay, so it became a monarchy. Now it's important to understand that when the nation became a nation, it was not just a monarchy, but it was a theocracy. Theocracy is the fundamental belief that it is God who rules the nation. And the deity's regent on earth is the earthly kings, Saul, Solomon, David, whoever. But so yes, it was a monarchy, but it was understood by the Hebrew people themselves to be a theocracy. And that was the ideology, or the that was, the message that came forth from the king. It's not just me who's up here. It's ultimately God that we're all answerable to. Well, the nation, the monarchy, divided itself, had a civil war between the North and the South. Unlike America's Civil War, the North won. It was the North rebelling against the South. In Israel's case, North won. They split into two nations, the divided monarchy, the Northern Kingdom and Judah, the Southern Kingdom. So there was a civil war. You start to see why I want to emphasize that there are various perspectives and there's diversity of ideas in the Hebrew Bible, because some of the texts that show up in the Hebrew Bible come from the North, some of them come from the South. Some of them come from a time prior to that division, some come from a time prior to a monarchy at all. Wow, if you were pretty comfortable with being a tribal confederation and you liked the freedom that gave, would you really be in favor of a monarchy, or would you be a little bit suspicious? Well, there's some text in there a little bit suspicious of what this new king might be. On the other hand, if you were writing as a part of David's royal court, you think you'd be in favor of the monarchy? Well, sure you would. And not just any old monarchy, David's monarchy. And if you were writing from Jerusalem and you were a priest in the Jerusalem temple, do you think you'd be supportive of that Jerusalem temple? Well, sure you would. But what if you were writing from the perspective of Bethel in Benjamin in the Northern Kingdom? That was a national shrine for the Northern Kingdom. Do you think you'd be in favor of Jerusalem, or might have some questions there? Well, there's a diversity of ideas, and you start to see why when you start to realize that there's a Northern Kingdom and a Southern Kingdom in different periods of time. Well, first the Northern Kingdom was defeated by Syria. Then, 100 years or so later, Southern Kingdom was defeated by the Babylonians. So you have a defeat of the nation. Well, that's going to raise a few questions. If we are a theocracy and we are ruled by God and we just got defeated, what does that mean? And, Babylon, they say that they're a theocracy too, and they're ruled by Marduk, and Babylon defeated us. It's going to raise some questions. And a lot of the text, a lot of what I've kind of spent some time researching is, how did ancient Israel think through that dilemma, that problem, that issue? Well, while the nation never came back in the Hebrew Bible times, not until the time of the Maccabees, which is really after the period that we're looking at. It didn't form as an independent, autonomous nation again once it lost its independence to Babylon in 587. But it does come back as a province of Persia, perhaps a temple state to some extent. In other words, a state whose political and military alliances and that aspect of their nationhood is carried out by and controlled by Persia. The religious and temple cultic aspect of the national life is carried out in Jerusalem. So that's part of what's going on. That perspective is going to be to give another collection of ideas and opinions and views. And so I want to emphasize that there are that the text was written over over a long period of time, 1,000 years, across wide diversity of geographical areas, and from many different political, ideological, and religious perspectives. It's diversity of ideas that's in there. And instead of trying to box it all in and control it, we want to explore these various voices. And that's when we're going to start to see the text come alive, and you start to see these ancient people say, here's what I think about things. And this is in describing these ideas, these various perspectives. That's the approach of this class. One thing that I do want to emphasize about what these texts are talking about, by and large, not exclusively, but by and large, they're talking about national identity to a large extent. Who are we as Yahweh's people? Who are we if we are living under at the time of Josiah? Seems to be a very strong king who's bringing about a lot of reform, but there's a lot of optimism about what we might become. Who do we think we are as Yahweh's people? Or what about Ezekiel? Man, we just got defeated by the Babylonians. Who are we as a people? Who are we as a nation? What do we think about Yahweh now? If a text is written during the time of David, what does that say? What are they writing about their national identity? Number two, the texts are written largely from the perspective of a theocracy, that the nation is controlled and ruled by Yahweh, by a deity, by God. Okay? And whether the nation is an autonomous, independent political entity, or whether it's a temple state or a province who owes its allegiance to Persia, okay, it understands Yahweh to be in control, God to be in control, and it has a theocratic perspective. And then third, and we've already hit this, there's a variety of perspectives, ideas, a variety of ideas in the text. It's not monolithic. Finally, look for some images to be aware of. And when I say images, I mean images that represent a fundamental question that faced the ancient Israelites. And that question is, it's almost a question of survival. It's a question of order versus chaos. If you're an ancient Israelite, you live in an agrarian culture, an agrarian society, an agrarian lifestyle. It is virtually a hand-to-mouth existence. If you have a bad drought one year, your family may very well be destroyed. Your property may be, you may have to sell off your property, you may have to sell off yourselves as slaves. That is a financial disaster, and it could affect your very survival as people, as a family. So order and chaos are very important. Order is predictability. I can predict what's coming. I predict how much rain is going to fall. I can predict that the crops are going to grow. I can predict that my sheep are going to multiply, that they'll produce healthy wool that I can sell. Predictability. And, or even if a drought's coming, man, if I could at least predict it, boy, that sure would help. Okay? Chaos is unpredictability. It is, oh my goodness, all this stuff is happening and I can't control it. Okay? And that's when survival becomes tenuous. There are images that convey order and chaos. Water imagery is either as a drought or a flood. Water represents chaos. Wilderness. Wilderness is that edge, marginal territory out there. It is where you wander into the wilderness. Well, you may come back, but if you get lost out there, you could die. It's a marginal kind of existence. Okay? The most ordered life is in the city. And particularly for someone who lives in the royal court and is very used to the Jerusalem temple and the courtly affairs and all of that, civilization. Civilization is the control of all of these various elements. And civilization is important. So order and chaos and images that are associated with it, water, wilderness, civilization, all of these are important items to look for as we go through the text. And there'll be a lot of others, and we'll pick them out as we come across them. Look for also political parties. We've already talked about the diversity of ideas, but one of the things that we're going to be focusing in on are political parties, and we're going to roughly kind of talk about the Deuteronomists and the priests. The Deuteronomists are those folks who are associated very closely with the laws that show up in Deuteronomy. The priests are associated very much with those ideas and concepts that show up in the final version of the Torah, or the law. And so those are political parties that we're going to, and they didn't always see eye to eye on things, and we're going to kind of highlight that. There were other circles out there, traditions, groups that had their own sets of ideas and concepts and thoughts. Wisdom circles, scribes, certain prophetic circles, although the prophets weren't a unified group. There were prophets who were priests, prophets who were Deuteronomists, prophets who had other allegiances. Getting back to the idea and to summarize this idea of approach, I'm going to take a descriptive approach, but it's also going to be a descriptive approach that travels somewhat regularly through time, a chronological approach, generally speaking. We're going to hit early on in the text, and if you've looked at your syllabus, and I trust that you have, we're going to look at some background material and archaeology and some things like that. But then we're going to start talking about the Deuteronomistic literature and the book of Deuteronomy. This was a very early collection. Wasn't the earliest literature that's out there. Wasn't the earliest stories that were out there. Wasn't the earliest collection. But it was the earliest material that started to be canonized, that started to become authoritative. And so the Deuteronomistic literature is sort of what we will, and I'll define that a little bit later in the term. Then we'll start to look at the priestly literature. The priestly literature came a little bit later, but again, it's a collection of literature that started to be authoritative and canonized and deal with these issues in a canonical, authoritative sort of way. Priestly literature. That'll be the second step. We're going to look at the prophetic literature, and there we're going to see a lot of different ideas, It's not going to be quite as unified as what we saw in either the Deuteronomistic or the priestly literature. And then we're going to see writings. I'm going to look a little bit about them. Not quite so much because we're going to be running into time issues, but that's one thing we'll be touching upon. Again, I want to go over what we've looked at in today's lesson in session 2, and just to summarize a little bit. We talked about the order and the organization of the Hebrew Bible. The Torah, the prophets or Nevi'im, and the writings, the Ketuvim. Then we talked about how the approach to this in this class was going to be descriptive. And it's going to be fundamentally asking the question, what was the text trying to say in the past? What was it trying to say historically? Again, when I talk about what I try and do in class and in my work, I consider myself to be a historian of ideas. I want to describe those ideas that happened in the past. The normative question, what does this text mean for me, is an important text, and a question I encourage you to think about within the context of your own faith, or if you're an atheist, even within that context. But it's not a text it's not a question that I'm going to be raising in this class. We talked about the time frame. The main thing that this text was written and collected over a period of about 1,000 years. And the main thing I wanted to draw out of there was that there's going to be a variety of ideas that show up in the Hebrew text. It's not just a monolithic book that fell out of the sky. And then I talked about how we're going to follow this descriptive approach in a chronological fashion. We will, and that should be reflected in your syllabus. All right. When we come back next, we'll start looking at the geography of the land and start looking about some of the background material. Thank you for your attention in this session. Email me if you have questions about this session, and I trust that your semester is getting off to a good start.